It was a hard thing for me to do the research because I didn't get a proper focus. I think after what I'm going to tell you, you will see that I believe that even after we went agile, after we went into a different modus for performance management, most performance management is still blinding us, is creating us to be more asocial rather than social. And the last thing is also creating irresponsibility. So let's see whether I can make that point if I go through it. And now I'm going to try to show you the slides. I mean, that's the old world. I'm not going too much into the old world, but the old world is basically pigeon training. And I think I don't need to say so much more about that, but because Otti sent around the slides, you saw on his slides also this kybernetic way to look at it. So you start with target setting, you go into feedback, which is not really feedback, but more evaluation. And then you tie, of course, carrots and sticks to it. Now, what Jon was telling us is that this is maybe a thing of the past. And I think indeed a lot of companies have done something with their performance management, a lot of big companies even. And what we can see here, and I just like the way she put it here with the figure, is that we went into a more agile mode, meaning that we try to do things more continuously. We try to be also communicating more clearly what are our expectations, where do we see each other. So this, I think, in a lot of companies has happened, albeit very often more in the way that we have mainly redesigned feedback. But that's just one thing to say up front. So if I then go into the same 4 buckets we heard before, then I think what we can see, then rather than have this yearly goal, we now have something like OKRs or fast goals, rather than to have really nothing during the year, because that's what I was told, that managers wouldn't want to do any feedback rounds. We now have what we call meaningful conversations. So we also were very creative in the way we named it. Whether they're always meaningful, that's another issue. We now have at least not only quantitative measures when we look at performance, and but Steffi will agree with me, that's more on paper than in practice. We have all seen Dan Pink's video. So we talked about getting rid of pay for performance. In fact, we haven't really. But I mean, that's another point. I mean, let's just assume that would be the case. But what I'm going to argue, as I already said, still we have a lot of problems, even with these new tools. And that's what I want to look at. So if we go to OKRs, then I still have to start with SMART goals, because that's also behind OKRs. And I have to tell you why I believe that SMART goals are not always that smart. What's the problem here? And for me, there are 2 things. I mean, the problem with SMART goals is that they're really effective. Maybe let's put it this way. Because it's effective to have specific goals, because as soon as it is specific, people are focusing, and that's a good thing. If you're in a machine-like organization, you want them to focus. But of course, the downside of that is in the moment where we want people see weak signals, spot blind spots, be mindful, sensing, probing, whatever we have as words up there, it's very difficult, because in effect, it can also work as a blinder. So we have very selective attention to really reach these specific goals. So that's one problem with specific goals. And the other thing, which is also hidden in this SMART goal abbreviation, is that we say they need to be ambitious, the right ambition level. Of course, we never know what the right ambition level is. But if we are too ambitious, there are 2 problems. If people are having not very high self-confidence, then we are undermining their self-efficacy. But nowadays, I think the bigger problem is that people have overconfidence. So Beserman was looking at the financial crisis, and he was effectively saying, well, that was the biggest problem because that was meeting masters of the universe, and what they were doing, they were gaming and had a lot of unethical behaviors. So just bear that a little bit in mind if we now go to OKRs. And I was a little bit cheeky. I didn't take OKRs because I also believe that most companies do not really do OKRs in the maybe proper way, but they are more keen to do something like fast goals. So fast goals, another abbreviation. We love that in management science. That's here one from Sloan Management Review. And what you can see, it's more agile because it's much more often. It's not just once in a year. And it's also bottom up in addition because it's frequently discussed. So I mean, in that way, it's more agile. But as you can see here, two things which I still find really highly problematic. They're still specific, which is kind of strange if you say there is a lot of emergence and we want to see the weak signals, because you still have potentially the blinding effects here. And that I find really problematic. They are even overambitious. That's what they say. They want it to be overambitious. And you also see a little bit the not very nice man model behind here, because then you minimize the risk of sandbagging. So you can see the old worldview here as well. And what I told you about what Beserman found out with these yearly goals is even more a high risk if you have these goals in a much shorter cadence. So if you have them every quarter, for instance. So we have at least a lot of lab research which shows that leads to self-depletion. And then we can show in the lab we have a lot of irresponsibility, so a lot of unethical behavior. That might be interesting for you, Simon, but probably you already know that. And I think that's just something which hasn't really arrived in practice so strongly, but it's just something we need to bear in mind with that tool. So what could be another way to do it, or at least how could we have additional aspects? I mean, I heard somebody say, why wouldn't we ditch performance management completely? So what about not having a GPS, but only a compass? That's one idea. So we would only have average goals and work towards these long-term goals. Or what about learning goals? Yet another point where we have much less of the troubles I was just mentioning here. Or what about on-goal time? Nothing new, but we still don't do it all the time. With on-goal time, we at least have this blinder effect going away a little bit. So that's the first thing. I think even with the goals, so if you just look at these singular practices, there is more thought needed than we have put into performance management so far. Now, if I go to the next one, I think we would all agree here, most has happened, but I just give you still a short wrap up. This is what we used to do was the performance management. I'm not even sure whether we used to do that or whether we are not still doing this, just more often. And that's an old meta-analysis, but the funny thing is nothing ever happened in between. We still have the same effect. Performance management, feedback never impacted performance, which is quite interesting. If you have the zero in a meta-analysis, it's always bad news. And what I also like about this year, these two authors, especially Ariel Kluger, they tried then, should we give it differently? Should we have the sandwich technique and whatnot? They came up, it always was the same picture. And so Ariel decided to become a listening researcher rather than a feedback researcher, which I really love because usually researchers sit on their ideas and never leave them again. And he showed that listening is much more effective than feedback. Well, this I don't really, I thought I would never have to show that again. Now SAP in Germany wants to reintroduce that. Even worse, of course, if you do feedback in connection with ranking or rating. I think most of you have heard this study by Rock, where they were showing very nicely, it doesn't matter whether you do rating or ranking. If you are not the top of the pops, then you end up like this. You end up in a fight or flight mode, and every conversation is just useless in that moment. And what's also interesting, they could show that performance went down a whole month, still a whole month after this talk. And by the way, for both, even for the top performer, maybe a different reason, because they felt, well, good. For the others, they were obviously not very satisfied with that. I, however, believe the problem here is even stronger if you look at this in the middle or the long term, because what these type of performance systems bring with them is what we call in research a sorting effect. So you get people into the company which are very competitive oriented, or they have been also called the hawks. And if you have too many hawks in your company, then they pick the doves to death, if you want to put it this way. So you have a lot of sabotage and not very nice aspects. So here you can see very nicely why I said irresponsible and asocial. So of course we now in most companies say, no, let's do that differently. We do it on the basis of positive psychology, so strengths oriented, excellence, feed forward. So we have all that nice kind of things happening in company. Here I would say we have made most progress, but I can already see where we even take this to a degree where it's also not healthy again. And now that's funny. I didn't know that Jon would be coming up with this I don't like it at all, Ray Dalio 200 principles thingy. Because some were thinking, well, the best thing is to be always transparent, to always give feedback every second. Let's get an app or something like that, and then we're all happy. And there are several things to say about that. The first thing I really like is Easton Bernstein was doing a lot of research on transparency and showing that there is a transparency paradox. The more transparent you are, the more private people get, because they then feel, oh, I have to put up a face. So you get a lot of impression management. You get a lot of things you wouldn't want to have. A little bit more privacy usually is much better if you look at it from the performance perspective. But that's not all. I just want to say, what are the assumptions here? The assumptions are everybody knows whether you are performing or not, or at least that cancels each other. Any biases are canceled each other out. Really? Is that really true? Is that the truth coming out if we're doing it this way? And the second assumption is performance obviously is just an individual thing. It has nothing to do with how we do things together. There are no synergies left, nothing like that. So again, I find that problematic. I just flag it up. And that's why I also called it terror by feedback app. And we saw that even in research sometimes. But anyway, so let's go to the next one, because I think that's one of the biggest problems we still have. And that's the question is, I mean, Steffi started with that, what is performance? So do we take something to be performance, what we can measure? That's what we very often do. Or do we really want to get at something which we find meaningful, which is performance? And then we often land into the problem that we can't measure it. And that's why Kevin, which I believe he's a very courageous guy, because that's very difficult to get that into our journal. He was writing an article, performance evaluation really should die, because it's just not performing very easily. And also the two guys I was just mentoring, Kluge and Denise, they did also a looking back on 100 years of research on performance evaluation and came up really with the same insights. It's very hard to measure performance, and we cannot, there seems to be no way to get across the biases we have. So you can train people till the cows come home, it doesn't help. And then if you say, well, we do a 360 degree, that also doesn't help, because I mean, obviously your peers have a different view on your performance than yourself and the supervisor. And here I was very graciously leaving something in here, but maybe there is no Schnittmenge, I don't know the English word for that. So at least that is what they're saying. There's much more biases in the evaluation than there is truth. And then that's, of course, very problematic. And then it's also understandable that people are reacting with reactants to performance evaluation, because it's simply not showing how good they really are. And then the last thing they're saying, and on top of that, it's very expensive, but it doesn't correlate with organizational performance. So why still do it? But of course, we all know that we still need to do it, because we need it for so many things. So, but I think this is just a really big problem, and nobody really has a proper solution for that yet. not going into that one. We are also debating about performance distribution. What I can say, I think both are wrong. It's certainly not a normal distribution, because that's just statistically nonsense. And then somebody came up, one of the big performance researchers then started to say, well, it's probably the power law distribution, which on the first view looks maybe more like many people would think it is. But you also have to see how they came up with that. For instance, they took articles published, and for researchers, you can show only for articles published that it looks like that. But if you think that performance is multifaceted, then you also will quickly see that this is probably not the curve we should be looking at. And this one, I think maybe, Simon, that's for you very interesting. All these biases also have real big real life effect, even societal effect. And I really like that paper by Van Dijk, where they looked at how this initial differences with education, for instance, or even just social category-based differences can then in the end emerge to a very strong social inequality in society, even through the way we are perpetuating and social inequalities in companies. And I give you just two examples, then maybe it gets a little bit clearer. So say for some reasons, you are seen from the beginning that you might not belong to the talent pool. If you don't belong to the talent pool, then it's very hard for you to develop the same knowledge and abilities like others who are in the talent pool, which then of course means that you will get a little bit less of a good job performance evaluation, and you end up with different opportunities and rewards. This is then perpetuated because, of course, the supervisor is looking at you in a different way once you have these verdicts. My most favorite study here or effect is the Pygmalion effect. I mean, maybe a lot of you already know that effect, but it's just, yeah, it's also a very nice study, not allowed any longer. End of the 60s, primary school, researchers went there and did an intelligence test with all the pupils. And then they went to the teachers and lied to them, because they just chose randomly some pupils and said, well, we did this talent test. We can tell you who the talent are in your class. And a year later, they went back, did again the intelligence test. And then strikingly, those pupils which had been chosen randomly were much better in the intelligence than the control group, because intelligence is plastic as well. And that's, of course, you have to explain that it's just because the teachers believe you're a talent, you're really becoming a talent. And that, of course, has something to do, and that fills in here very nicely, that you challenge people more where you think these are talents, and you are also supporting them more. And what they then do, they look at this on every stage, so you have it also on the network level, etc. And they can show you start maybe with a small difference and you end up with a much bigger difference in the end because of these different biases we have in organizations, which are cumulative. So what I want to say is that we don't get performance evaluation right is a real huge problem if you're interested, for instance, in social justice, just to take one example. And at the very least, we shouldn't go and claim that somebody who's on the top really is probably the person who has the highest merit. So the meritocracy, we should be at least a little bit more humble. But that's just also one other aspect here to mention. And now let's go in the last one. The last one I have done a lot of research in, and in fact, I think the first study I did is 15 years ago. We were then told we were Marxists. Very interesting. But then Pink now came along, and so it's not so difficult any longer to bring up what we found. So individual variable performance contingent pay. So Pink piece rate, but for managers, has a lot of negative effects. The first one is, at least we found that always, that it is undermining intrinsic motivation, because you tend to think about the money and not so much about the task. What I believe is the much more serious effect, though, is what is called multitasking. It makes you focus even stronger on what you are rewarded or what the goal is set on, and it makes you neglect everything else. And if you take that together with what I just told you, that we can't measure the most important thing, then you already know where people will focus on and how that's not what you want to have. We were also able to show that it, in the end, has a negative effect on performance, which is also kind of funny because it's called performance contingent pay. For some of the reasons I also said, for also reasons that it destroys your social behavior, so your organizational citizenship behavior goes down. And then it creates such a lot of hidden costs. And I mean, it's not only that you have a compensation department in your company, but you also have almost every 2 or 3 years new compensation consultants in your company because that system never works. So in a certain way, it would be a no-brainer to get rid of it. And the question, of course, is why wouldn't we get rid of it? And this is, I don't have to tell you because I think you all saw then Pink. And this is something I'm going to share with Stephanie because that's collective performance pay. But I just want to go to the last elephant in the room because I believe why can't we get rid of performance contingent pay is because of CEO pay. Because of course, why is there pay, in my opinion, now this is just an opinion, this is not research, but I find their pay outrageously high. 344 to 1 is not what I think should be the relation. But from research, we can show very interestingly that CEO pay is not correlated with organizational performance. So that cannot be the reason in the end why we do it. But of course, if you then go into the explanations, and that's why I said it might be one of the problems why we cannot change a lot. Here, for instance, Otti's finding or idea, sorry, it wasn't a finding, comes back. Some researchers have shown it has a lot to do with ideology. So if the CEO is a conservative and the board are conservatives, then usually they find it okay this way. If they're both liberals, which I think translated in German is Sozialdemokrat, then it looks differently. So you see all this, or power, of course, Simon, is a very big issue here as well. If you would want to get rid of it, another study I found quite interesting. So this is from a political scientist who compared different systems, and he tried to find out what are the configurations which allow for a lower pay dispersion, meaning, of course, that also normal employees will earn more. So you have more decent wages, but that also the CEO earns less. Then what he found out, it's only possible in a highly developed country. So, I mean, this is one of the things we were always told. Or I shouldn't say it this way. That's what he found in the empirical data. And then he found that you either have a state where there's some regulations or a strong welfare state, or you have strong unions. If you have neither of these, it's very difficult to have a fairer pay dispersion. That is probably still a lot of shallow critique, but I still believe it's important, even once we decided what we really want to focus on, because it, of course, still bites us back if we don't understand these problems once we decided where we want to go to. It's also problematic if you would now ask about impact, if you would now ask about flourishing, although I didn't really hate it.